The silence that falls when an apex predator enters a room is absolute. Ice clinking in glasses stops. Conversations die in throats. When Don Carmelo, a ghost of a boss from the old country, stepped into the restaurant, seasoned killers stared rigidly at their plates. He fired off a harsh, gravelly demand in a regional dialect no one in the city had spoken for 50 years. Then a shy waitress with trembling hands poured his wine, looked him in the eye, and answered perfectly. Nora Hayes existed in the negative space of Lombra. She was 24, chronically exhausted, and an expert at being invisible. In a high-end dining room where politicians cut deals with men who didn't officially exist, invisibility was a survival skill. She adjusted the stiff white apron around her waist, the fabric biting into her hip bones. The kitchen was a pressure cooker of shouting line cooks, hissing steam, and the sharp scent of garlic hitting hot oil. But tonight, the chaos felt different. It was tight, brittle. Paul, the floor manager, was sweating through his bespoke suit. He kept checking his watch, pacing the narrow corridor between the walk-in freezer and the prep stations. Paul usually strutted through the restaurant like a king, belittling the busboys and flirting aggressively with the hostesses. Tonight, he looked like a man waiting for his own execution. "Wipe down table 7 again," Paul snapped, spotting Nora standing near the service station. "And if I see a single water spot on those wine glasses, I'm taking it out of your tips." Nora nodded, grabbing a fresh linen cloth. She didn't argue. She slipped out through the swinging doors into the dining room. The main floor of Lombra was a masterclass in intimidation, masquerading as luxury. Heavy mahogany paneling swallowed the dim, amber lighting. The booths were deep leather, designed to offer privacy and muffle voices. At the very back sat table 7. It was a large, circular booth positioned perfectly. It offered a clear view of the entrance and the kitchen doors, while remaining completely guarded from behind by a solid brick pillar. It was the boss's table. Matteo Valenti sat there alone. Matteo was a man who occupied space with terrifying stillness. He didn't fidget. He didn't check his phone. He sat with his broad shoulders squared, a roc's glass of amber liquid resting near his right hand. He was the head of the Valenti family now, having ruthlessly modernized his father's sprawling empire over the last 5 years. He traded the bloody street corners for high-rise boardrooms, union contracts, and silent leverage. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Nora made in a year, and his dark eyes tracked every movement in the room with cold, mechanical precision. Nora kept her eyes down as she approached the adjacent tables. She polished glasses that were already immaculate. She could feel the ambient anxiety rolling off Matteo. It wasn't fear. It was a heavy, suffocating anticipation. He was waiting for his father. Don Carmelo Valenti hadn't set foot on American soil in a decade. He ran the Sicilian side of the family's old interests from a heavily fortified villa outside Palermo. Rumors about him circulated among the staff like ghost stories. They said he still settled disputes with a garrote. They said he viewed his son's Americanized operation as weak, corporate, and soft. The front doors of the restaurant opened, the subtle hum of the dining room, the clinking of heavy silver against china, the low murmur of discreet conversations snapped off. It didn't fade. It died instantly. Nora froze, a polished wine glass gripped in her hand. She pressed her back against the dark wood of a pillar, shrinking into the shadows. 3 large men walked in first. They didn't look like Matteo's tailored, silent security. These men were built like brick walls, wearing suits that didn't quite hide the bulk of their shoulders or the weapons holstered beneath their jackets. They fanned out, their eyes sweeping the room with blatant, aggressive suspicion. Then came Don Carmelo. He was shorter than his son, and older than the rumors suggested. He walked with a heavy silver-tipped cane, his back slightly bowed with age. But his eyes were terrifying. They were pale, watery, and utterly devoid of warmth. He wore a heavy wool coat despite the mild weather, and the smell of cheap raw tobacco and stale espresso clung to him. Matteo stood up. He didn't rush forward, but he stepped out from the booth. The two men met in the center of the dining room. There was no embrace, no clapping of shoulders. Carmelo looked at his son, then dragged his pale eyes around the opulent dining room. His lip curled, revealing a flash of yellowed teeth. He muttered something under his breath. It wasn't Italian, not the musical, rolling Italian they taught in language apps, nor the sharp, fast Italian Matteo sometimes used when he was angry. It was a thick, guttural dialect, harsh consonants and swallowed vowels. Nora felt a strange jolt in her chest. She recognized the rhythm. It was the sound of her childhood living room, the sound of her grandfather cursing at the television, slapping dominoes on a wobbly card table. Carmelo had just called the restaurant a whorehouse built for tourists. Matteo's jaw tightened, a small muscle ticking near his ear, but he simply gestured toward table 7. The Don began the slow walk to the back. Every patron in the restaurant kept their heads lowered. Nobody spoke. The silence was heavy enough to crush bone. Nora clutched her tray to her chest and slipped back into the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. The real ordeal hadn't even begun. The kitchen was a state of controlled panic. Arthur, the senior waiter who usually handled Matteo's table, was pale and sweating. He was a veteran of high-end dining, a man who prided himself on handling celebrities and mobsters with equal, detached professionalism. But as he prepared the tray with the first round of appetizers, burrata, cured meats imported specifically for tonight, and a $1,000 bottle of Barolo, his hands were shaking. "He's miserable," Arthur hissed to Paul, uncorking the wine. "The old man, he won't even look at the menu, he just glares at everything." "Just pour the wine, serve the plates from the left, and get out of there," Paul muttered, wiping his own forehead. "Do not engage." Arthur grabbed the tray, took a deep breath, and pushed through the doors. Nora hung back near the espresso machine, cleaning the steam wand for the 4th time. She didn't want to be anywhere near the floor right now. She just wanted her shift to end so she could take the subway back to her cramped studio apartment, soak her aching feet, and forget this world existed. Less than 2 minutes later, the kitchen doors burst open. Arthur stumbled backward, his face flushed red, clutching the bottle of Barolo. "I can't do it," Arthur choked out, setting the bottle down so hard it nearly shattered. He snapped at me. He started yelling, pointing at the glasses, pointing at the meat. I tried to speak Italian to him, standard Italian, and he just spat on the floor. On the floor, right next to my shoe. "What did he say?" Paul demanded, grabbing Arthur by the shoulder. "I don't know. It sounded like he was chewing gravel. Matteo told me to leave. I can't go back out there. He's going to kill me. He actually looked like he wanted to kill me over the prosciutto." Paul cursed violently, running a hand over his slicked back hair. He looked around the kitchen, his eyes locked on Nora. "Hayes," Paul barked. Nora stiffened. "No, Paul, please. I'm just a junior server." "You're a server who doesn't talk," Paul said, grabbing the bottle of Barolo and shoving it into her hands. "You don't make eye contact. You don't get flustered. You just freeze. Right now, freezing is good. Go out there. Change the wine glasses." He obviously hated the modern ones. "Take the heavy crystal from the reserve cabinet. Pour the wine. Do not speak. If he yells, let him yell. Just pour." Nora's fingers gripped the cold glass of the bottle. She wanted to refuse, but she needed this job. Rent was due in 4 days. She swallowed hard, nodded, and grabbed a fresh tray. She walked out onto the floor. The restaurant was still agonizingly quiet. The other patrons were eating in hushed, mechanical movements, desperate not to draw attention. Nora kept her eyes fixed on the mahogany table as she approached table 7. Carmelo was leaning back in the booth, tapping his silver-tipped cane against the floorboard. Matteo sat rigidly across from him. The tension between father and son was a physical wall. Nora approached the table. She placed the tray down silently on a fold-out stand. She reached over, removing the modern stemless wine glasses Arthur had set, and replaced them with the heavy, traditional crystal goblets. Carmelo watched her. His pale eyes felt like dirty ice sliding down the back of her neck. As she reached over to collect the plate of rejected cured meats, her forearm brushed too close to Carmelo's water glass. She didn't knock it over, but the ice clinked sharply. Carmelo's hand slammed flat on the table. The sharp crack made Nora flinch, her shoulders instantly hunching toward her ears. Carmelo leaned forward, glaring at her, and unleashed a rapid, bitter string of words. Nora didn't need a translation app. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her head. Carmelo wasn't just insulting her clumsiness. He was insulting American women. He was lamenting that his son surrounded himself with incompetent, frail creatures who didn't know how to serve, didn't know their place, and brought dishonor to a meal simply by breathing near it. Sti femmini d'America mangiano pani a tradimento. Manca lu rispetto, manca la creanza. Luvati davanti prima che mi scordo cusugno. These American women, they eat bread treacherously, are useless. No respect, no manners. Get out of my face before I forget who I am. Matteo shifted, raising a hand to intervene. Papa, basta. She's just a waitress. Nora didn't walk away. She didn't cower. Something deep inside her, a stubborn, defensive spark forged by years of caring for a bitter, dying Sicilian immigrant in a tiny apartment, flared to life. She was exhausted, her feet hurt, and she was tired of men taking their anger out on her. She set the plate back down. She picked up the bottle of Barolo, uncorked it with smooth, practiced movements, and poured exactly 4 ounces into Carmelo's glass. Then she looked directly into the old man's pale eyes. She didn't raise her voice. She kept her tone flat, deferential, but laced with the unmistakable grit of the old country. Mi scusasi, Don Carmelo, Nora said quietly, the heavy, guttural syllables rolling off her tongue with native fluency. U me sangue ammiscatu, ma I me manu sunnu fermi, u vinu e bonu. Si voli, u vivu, si no, ci portu acqua ca non costa niente. Excuse me, Don Carmelo. My blood is mixed, but my hands are steady. The wine is good. If you want, drink it. Otherwise, I'll bring you water that costs nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. At the surrounding tables, nobody moved. The 3 massive bodyguards at the next booth shifted, their hands dropping toward their jackets. Matteo Valenti froze. He looked at Nora, truly looked at her for the first time. His dark eyes widened a fraction, a crack in his stone facade, staring at the mousy waitress who had just addressed his ruthless father in a dead language, effectively telling him to drink his expensive wine or settle for tap water. Don Carmelo sat perfectly still. He stared at Nora. For 5 agonizing seconds, the air in the restaurant was thick enough to choke on. Then, slowly, the corners of Carmelo's mouth twitched. The twitch turned into a low, gravelly chuckle that rattled in his chest. He reached out with a weathered, heavily ringed hand, picked up the crystal goblet, and took a slow sip of the Barolo. He swallowed, set the glass down, and looked at Matteo. In the same thick dialect, Carmelo said, "Finally, someone in your damn house with a spine." Nora did not smile. She didn't let out a sigh of relief, and she certainly didn't gloat. She simply offered a short, rigid nod, picked up her empty tray, and stepped back into the periphery of the dining room. The tension in Lombra didn't evaporate, but it mutated. The lethal, suffocating pressure eased into something closer to heavy curiosity. The bodyguards at the adjacent table settled back into their leather booth, their hands moving away from their lapels. In the kitchen, Paul was gripping the edge of the stainless steel prep counter so hard his knuckles were entirely white. When Nora pushed through the swinging doors, he stared at her like she had just walked out of a burning building without a scratch. "What happened?" Arthur hissed, hovering near the dish pit. "I saw him hit the table. Did he fire you? Did he tell Matteo to kill us?" "He drank the wine," Nora said quietly. She set her tray down, her hands finally beginning to betray her. A fine, uncontrollable tremor worked its way through her fingers. The adrenaline was breaking, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in her stomach. "You're taking the rest of their courses," Paul said. It wasn't a request. His voice was hoarse. "Arthur, you stay back. Hayes, you run the food. Nobody else goes near table 7. For the next 2 hours, Nora lived in a strange, isolated bubble of high-stakes service. She carried heavy porcelain plates of bone marrow, veal osso buco, resting in pools of dark, rich reduction, and delicate roasted root vegetables. She moved with mechanical precision. Every time she approached the table, the conversation between father and son stopped. It wasn't out of respect, it was an old-world habit. You didn't discuss family business in front of the help. But Carmelo's pale eyes tracked her hands every time she set down a plate. Matteo watched her differently. He didn't stare openly like his father. He caught her in the reflections of the window pane, or observed the scuffed, cheap black orthopedics she wore instead of the standard leather flats. He noticed the fraying hem of her apron. He noticed that she didn't look at the floor anymore, but she didn't look them in the eye either. She looked exactly at their collarbones, a perfect waiter's trick to appear attentive, without seeming challenging. When it was time for espresso, Carmelo finally spoke to her again. "Come ti chiami?" he asked, his voice rough from cheap tobacco and expensive wine. "What is your name?" Nora placed the small ceramic cup in front of him. "Nora, signori." "Nora," Carmelo repeated. He made a low, approving sound in his throat. A good plain name. Not a stripper's name like these other girls. He glanced at his son. "Teach your men to hire girls who know how to work, Matteo. Not girls who want to be looked at." Matteo swirled the last dregs of his liquor. "I'll keep that in mind, Papa." His voice was perfectly neutral, but his dark gaze slid to Nora. The scrutiny felt heavy, analytical. It made the hairs on her arms stand up. At midnight, the dinner ended. Carmelo stood, leaning heavily on his silver-tipped cane. The bodyguards were instantly on their feet. Without a word to his son, the old man reached into his heavy wool coat, pulled out a thick roll of bills, secured by a rubber band, and peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills. He didn't leave them on the table. He reached out and shoved the money directly into the front pocket of Nora's apron. "Più to tempo," Carmelo grunted. "For your time." Nora froze, the weight of the cash pressing against her hip. "Thank you, Don Carmelo," she murmured in English. The old man turned and walked out, his men falling in step behind him. The entire restaurant seemed to exhale a collective, silent breath as the heavy wooden doors closed. Matteo didn't leave immediately. He remained in the booth. The busboys stayed hidden in the back, too terrified to come out and clear the table while the young boss was still sitting there. Nora knew she had to finish the job. She picked up her tray and approached the table, gathering the empty espresso cups. "Where did you learn it?" Matteo's voice was low, smooth, and completely devoid of the thick accent his father carried. He sounded like a man who spent his days in glass boardrooms, negotiating with ruthless executives. Nora paused, her hand hovering over a crumpled linen napkin. "My grandfather, sir." "Your grandfather," Matteo repeated. He leaned back, resting an arm along the top of the leather booth. "It's a dying dialect. Only the old men in the hills speak it now, the ones who refuse to die." "He was one of those," Nora said flatly. She stacked the saucers. She just wanted to go home. "Was? He passed away last year." She picked up the tray. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Valenti?" Matteo looked at her for a long, quiet moment. He was trying to read her, searching for the angle. In his world, everyone had an angle. People didn't just speak ancient Sicilian dialects in the middle of a cosmopolitan steakhouse by accident. But all he saw was a pale, tired girl with dark circles under her eyes and cheap shoes. "No, Nora," Matteo said softly. "That will be all." An hour later, Nora pushed through the heavy metal exit doors at the back of the kitchen, stepping into the freezing alleyway. The city air smelled like exhaust and wet concrete. She shoved her hands deep into her coat pockets, her fingers brushing against the $500 folded there. It was more money than she made in 2 weeks. It meant she could pay rent. It meant she could buy groceries that didn't come out of a tin can. She walked toward the subway, her breath pluming in the harsh streetlights. She told herself she had survived the night. She told herself she would go back to being invisible tomorrow. But deep down, feeling the phantom weight of Matteo Valenti's dark eyes burning into her back, she knew her quiet life was already over. Nora woke up the next morning to the rhythmic, violent clanging of her apartment's radiator. The studio was no larger than a walk-in closet, crammed above a noisy dry cleaner in a neighborhood where the streetlights had been broken since October. The air smelled perpetually of bleach and old cooking grease. She sat up, her joints popping, and rubbed the sleep from her eyes. She dragged herself to the tiny kitchenette, filled a dented kettle, and turned on the gas stove. As the water boiled, she pulled the $500 bills from her coat pocket. She laid them flat on the scratched formica counter, smoothing out the creases. It felt like dirty money. It probably was dirty money. But poverty didn't allow for moral grandstanding. She folded 3 of the bills and tucked them into the old coffee can under the sink where she kept her rent money. By the time she arrived at Lombra for the afternoon prep shift, the atmosphere had mutated again. The kitchen staff, usually a chaotic, loud brotherhood that ignored her entirely, parted like the Red Sea when she walked to the time clock. Hector, the gruff sous chef who usually yelled if she stood too close to the pass, gave her a brief, respectful nod. Paul was waiting near the service station. He looked exhausted, nursing a large black coffee. "Hayes," Paul said. He cleared his throat. "You're off the perimeter tonight. You're taking sections 1 and 2, the center floor." Nora stopped tying her apron. Sections 1 and 2 were the prime tables, the money tables. The veterans fought bloodily over those assignments. "Paul, I don't have the seniority for the center floor. Arthur is going to throw a fit. Arthur can complain to a brick wall," Paul muttered, rubbing his temples. "You're taking the center. Just keep doing whatever it is you're doing. The owner called this morning. Someone passed down word that the Valenti family was very pleased with the service last night. Do you understand what that means, Hayes? We didn't just avoid getting shot, we got an endorsement." Nora's stomach gave a slow, unpleasant lurch. She didn't want an endorsement. She didn't want her name known by men who solved problems with heavy, silent violence. Dinner service began at 6. The evening rush was steady, a blur of uncorking wine, reciting specials, and navigating the crowded floor. Nora was good at her job. She was efficient, quiet, and anticipated needs before the guests realized they had them. At 8:30, the front doors opened. The shift in the room's energy was subtle, but Nora felt it instantly. It was a drop in barometric pressure. She turned away from the POS terminal and saw him. Matteo Valenti walked in. He was alone this time. No massive bodyguards trailing him. No aging warlord father. He wore a dark navy suit with no tie, the collar of his crisp white shirt unbuttoned, making him look less like a boss and more like a wealthy, exhausted businessman. The hostess, a beautiful girl named Clara, practically tripped over herself rushing to greet him, gesturing toward table 7 in the back. Matteo shook his head. He pointed a single finger toward the center of the room, toward Nora's section. Clara swallowed hard, her pristine smile faltering, and led him to a small, two-top table right in the middle of the floor. It was a table meant for quiet dates, not mob bosses. Nora felt a prickle of cold sweat at the base of her spine. She grabbed a menu and a water pitcher, bracing herself. She walked over, her face set in a neutral, professional mask. "Good evening, Mr. Valenti. Tap or sparkling?" "Tap is fine, Nora," Matteo said. He didn't open the menu. He just watched her pour the water. His hands rested flat on the table. Clean, manicured, heavy. "Would you like to hear the specials, or can I start you with a drink?" "Black coffee, and then sit down." Nora froze, the pitcher suspended in the air. "Sir, I can't sit with patrons. It's against policy." Matteo glanced across the room toward the service station. Paul was standing there, watching them. Matteo offered the manager a flat, meaningless smile. Paul immediately turned around and vanished into the kitchen. "You're on your break," Matteo said, his attention snapping back to her. "Sit." It wasn't an invitation. Nora slowly pulled out the chair opposite him and sat on the very edge of the cushion, her back stiff. Matteo studied her face. Without the oppressive presence of his father, she could see the exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes. Running a criminal empire clearly didn't leave much time for sleep. "My father hasn't laughed at a dinner table since 2014, Matteo said quietly. "He usually ruins meals, fires staff, or breaks dishes. You insulted him to his face, and he paid you for the privilege." "I didn't insult him," Nora defended defensively, keeping her voice low. "I offered him a choice. He was trying to bully Arthur. Grandfather always said bullies only respect a bigger rock." A ghost of a smile touched Matteo's lips. It was a dangerous look on him. "Who was your grandfather?" "Nobody you would know." "Try me. His name was Vincenzo Russo. He was a baker." Nora folded her hands in her lap to hide the fact that she was gripping her apron. "He came over in the 70s. He didn't run numbers. He didn't have connections. He baked bread until his lungs gave out from the flour dust, and then he sat in an armchair and yelled at the television." Matteo leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The physical proximity was jarring. He smelled like expensive cologne and something inherently metallic. "He taught you the dialect," Matteo noted. "He refused to speak English in the apartment. If I wanted to eat, I had to learn his language." Nora swallowed dryly. "Mr. Valenti, why are you here?" "I eat dinner here, Nora. I own half the building." "You sit at table 7. You don't sit in the center of the room, and you don't interrogate the waitstaff." She forced herself to meet his dark eyes. "I'm just a waitress. I don't know anything about your world. I just want to do my job and go home." Matteo was silent for a long time. He seemed to be weighing her words, analyzing the genuine, exhausted fear beneath her defiance. "You know," Matteo said softly, "in my world, people lie to me every minute of every day. They tell me what I want to hear so I don't ruin them. Yesterday you stood in front of the most dangerous man I know, and you were completely honest." He stood up. He hadn't touched his water. He dropped a $100 bill on the table for a coffee he hadn't ordered. "I like honesty, Nora," Matteo said, buttoning his suit jacket. "I'll see you tomorrow." Nora sat frozen in the chair as he walked out. The restaurant buzzed around her, but she felt entirely alone. He wasn't just curious anymore. He was interested. And in the Valenti family, interest was a death sentence to a quiet life. Paranoia has a specific taste. It tastes like old copper pennies at the back of your throat. Nora chewed her thumbnail to the quick as she waited for the Q train. The subway platform was grim, bathed in flickering fluorescent light that made everyone look jaundiced. A rat dragged a slice of pizza along the edge of the tracks. Normally, Nora would just put her headphones in and stare blankly at the grime-coated tiles. Today, her eyes darted constantly. She kept looking for broad shoulders, dark suits, men who stood too still. Matteo's promise, "I'll see you tomorrow," felt less like a flirtation and more like a subpoena. She arrived at L'Ombra at 4 in the afternoon. The restaurant was empty of customers, but the prep work was already bleeding tension. Paul was pacing near the reservation podium. When he saw Nora walk in, he didn't bark at her to clock in. He just stared at her with a mixture of profound relief and deep resentment. "Section 1, Paul said quietly as she walked past. Again, Nora stopped. "Paul, Arthur is going to quit. He's been here for 6 years. "Arthur is taking the patio," Paul snapped, his voice tight. "I don't care if he quits. I care about keeping this restaurant breathing. You are on Section 1. Don't argue with me, Hayes. Just do it." She didn't argue. She tied her apron, feeling the stiff canvas bite into her waist, and went to the back to check the linen supply. Dinner service rolled in like a slow fog. 6 o'clock passed, then 7, then 8. Matteo didn't show up. By 9:30, the dinner rush peaked. The noise level rose to a comfortable, wealthy hum. Nora was carrying 3 plates of seared scallops on her left arm, navigating the tight spaces between chairs, when she noticed the men. They weren't sitting in her section. They were sitting at the bar. 2 men, both wearing muted grey suits that didn't scream mobster to the untrained eye, but their posture gave them away. They weren't drinking. They weren't talking to the bartender. They were watching the floor. Specifically, they were watching Nora. Every time she walked to the kitchen, their eyes tracked her. Every time she approached a table, they subtly shifted their weight to maintain a clear line of sight. She wasn't being watched by predators. She was being guarded. The realization hit her like a punch to the sternum. She nearly dropped a plate of scallops onto a hedge fund manager's lap. She managed to serve the table, her hands shaking, and retreated to the kitchen. She stood by the dish pit, gripping the stainless steel edge of the sink, trying to force air into her lungs. "Hey!" Hector, the sous chef, bumped her shoulder with his elbow. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the ticket printer. "You good, kid?" "Fine," Nora lied, her voice raspy. "Just hot in here. Drink some water. You look like a ghost." She survived the rest of the shift through sheer muscle memory. At midnight, Paul locked the front doors. The clean-up crew moved in. Nora changed out of her uniform, shoving her apron into her locker. She wanted to slip out the back, run to the subway, and lock herself in her tiny apartment. She pushed open the heavy metal exit door into the alleyway. The cold night air hit her face, smelling of damp brick and garbage. She took 2 steps before she saw it. A black, heavily tinted sedan was idling by the mouth of the alley. The headlights were off, but the low, muscular hum of the engine echoed off the brick walls. The back door clicked open. Matteo stepped out into the dull, amber glow of the street lamp. He wore a heavy wool overcoat over his suit. The city wind pulled at the hem, but he stood utterly motionless. He looked exhausted. Dark smudges bruised the skin under his eyes, and the harsh lines around his mouth were deeper than the night before. Nora stopped walking. Her instinct was to turn around and run back into the kitchen, but she knew it was pointless. "You didn't run from a Valenti. You just died tired. You didn't come to dinner," Nora said. Her voice sounded thin, defensive. "I had to settle a union dispute at the docks," Matteo replied. His voice was a low rumble, carrying effortlessly through the cold air. It took longer than expected. People rarely agree to lose money quickly. He didn't elaborate. Nora didn't want him to. In his world, settling a dispute usually meant someone was bleeding on a concrete floor. "Your men were at the bar," she said. She crossed her arms over her chest, hugging her cheap winter coat tightly around herself. Matteo didn't deny it. "The city is volatile right now. My father's arrival stirred up old grievances. People who hate him are looking for leverage. I can't have anyone thinking they can use you to get to me." "Use me?" Nora let out a short, incredulous laugh, the sheer absurdity of the statement momentarily overriding her fear. "Mr. Valenti, I poured your father a glass of wine. I'm a waitress. Nobody cares about me." "They care that my father respected you." Matteo stepped closer. Just 1 pace, but it felt like the alley shrank. "They care that I sat in the middle of a crowded room to drink coffee with you. In my world, perception is reality. You are visible now, Nora." "I don't want to be visible." Her voice cracked, echoing sharply off the damp walls. "I want to pay my rent. I want to buy groceries. I want to go to work and be entirely ignored. You're ruining that." Matteo looked down at her. He didn't look angry at her outburst. He looked resigned. It was the look of a man who knew exactly how toxic his touch was, but refused to pull his hand away. "I know," he said softly. "Get in the car, Nora. I'm taking you home." "I can take the train." "The queue line is shut down for track maintenance past midnight," Matteo said smoothly. "And even if it wasn't, you aren't walking home alone. Not tonight. Get in." It wasn't a request. The back door of the sedan stood open like a dark, velvet-lined trap. Nora looked at the empty street, then at the man standing between her and her quiet, broken life. Defeated, she walked forward and slid into the leather seat. The interior of the sedan was a sensory vacuum. The glass was thick enough to mute the city's chaotic noise to a distant, muffled hum. The air smelled of expensive leather and the faint, sharp tang of Matteo's cologne. Nora pressed herself against the passenger door, putting as much space between them as the back seat allowed. Matteo sat on the other side, his posture relaxed but inherently coiled. The driver, a massive wall of a man who didn't even glance in the rearview mirror, put the car in gear. "Address," Matteo said. Nora rattled off her street in the Bronx. She watched Matteo's jaw tighten slightly at the location. It was deep in the borough, a neighborhood where the cops only drove through with their windows rolled up. They rode in heavy silence for 20 minutes. The transition of the city through the tinted windows was stark. The glittering high-rises and pristine avenues melted away, replaced by shuttered storefronts, graffiti-scarred brick, and flickering streetlights. "You live far from the restaurant," Matteo finally noted, breaking the silence. "The rent is cheap," Nora said, staring out the window. And nobody asks for a guarantor if you pay 3 months in cash. It's not a safe neighborhood. Safety is a luxury tax, Mr. Valenti. I can't afford it. Matteo turned his head to look at her. The intermittent passing lights cast sharp, shifting shadows across his face. You don't talk like a waitress who dropped out of school. I didn't drop out, Nora corrected, keeping her eyes firmly on the passing streets. I finished my degree in accounting, but nobody hires a junior accountant whose last address was a shelter and who couldn't afford an unpaid internship because she had to feed her dying grandfather. The words slipped out before she could stop them. She clamped her mouth shut, instantly regretting the exposure. She didn't want his pity. Pity from a man like him was just another form of leverage. Matteo didn't offer pity. He didn't offer a hollow apology for her circumstances. Accounting, he murmured thoughtfully. Numbers are honest. They don't have agendas. I can see why you like them. The car turned onto Nora's street. It was a narrow, broken strip of asphalt lined with overflowing dumpsters and rusted fire escapes. The driver pulled up to the curb right in front of her building. The ground floor was a dry cleaner with a shattered neon sign. Above it, a row of dark, grimy windows stared blankly into the night. This is it, Nora said, reaching for the door handle. Wait. Matteo opened his door and stepped out into the cold. He buttoned his overcoat, his dark eyes scanning the street, the alleyways, the rooftops. He walked around the back of the car and opened Nora's door for her. She stepped out onto the cracked pavement. The biting wind immediately cut through her thin coat. Thank you for the ride, she said quickly, wanting to escape the overwhelming pressure of his presence. She turned toward the heavy, graffiti-covered metal door of her building. Matteo followed her. Mr. Valenti, you really don't need to— The lock on the front door is broken, Matteo interrupted, pointing at the shattered deadbolt hanging loosely from the metal frame. Has it been like that long? Since August, Nora said, her voice tight. The landlord doesn't care. Look, I'm fine. I just go up to the 3rd floor and lock my own door. Matteo didn't listen. He pushed the heavy metal door open. The hallway smelled of stale cabbage, cheap bleach, and wet dog. The single overhead bulb flickered erratically. He gestured for her to walk ahead. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed the narrow, creaking stairs. Having the head of the Valenti crime family walking behind her in this squalid stairwell felt like a fever dream. It was profoundly wrong. A wolf inside a rabbit hutch. They reached the 3rd floor. Nora stopped in front of apartment 3B. The door was chipped green wood with a heavy steel bar lock installed across the center. She dug her keys out of her pocket, her hands shaking slightly. She unlocked the deadbolt and slid the heavy bar back. She turned to face him. He was standing too close in the narrow hallway. The shadows hid his eyes, but she could feel the heat radiating from him in the freezing corridor. I'm inside, Nora said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm safe. You can go back to your world now. Matteo reached into his coat pocket. He didn't pull out cash this time. He pulled out a sleek black burner phone and held it out to her. Nora stared at it. No, absolutely not. Take it. If I take that, it means I belong to you. It means I owe you. She backed up a half step, hitting the green wood of her door. I don't owe anyone. I survive on my own. Matteo's hand shot out. He didn't grab her roughly, but his fingers wrapped around her wrist. His grip was warm, solid, and utterly immovable. He pressed the phone into her palm and curled her fingers over it. You don't owe me anything, Matteo said softly, his face leaning in just inches from hers. But the men who don't like my father don't care about your independence, Nora. They care about hurting me. And right now, you are the only civilian in this city who holds my attention." Nora's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't threatening her. He was confessing. It was a terrifying admission of a weakness he had no business having. "If someone follows you," Matteo continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rasp. "If someone looks at you wrong on the train, if a car idles too long outside this broken door, you press the single contact in that phone. You don't call the police, you call me." He released her wrist. His fingers lightly brushed the freezing skin of her knuckles before pulling away. "Lock the door, Nora." He turned and walked back down the dark stairwell. The heavy silence of his footsteps echoed briefly before fading away. Nora stood in the doorway, the cold plastic of the phone burning against her palm. She stepped inside, through the deadbolt, and slid the heavy steel bar into place. She slid down the back of the door until she hit the linoleum floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She was safe for the night. But looking down at the black phone clutched in her hand, she knew she was already caught in the net. 3 days passed. The burner phone sat in Nora's apron pocket, heavy as a brick. Every time she reached for a pen, her knuckles brushed the cold plastic. It remained silent. At Lombra, the ecosystem had inverted. Paul stopped yelling at her. In fact, Paul stopped looking at her altogether. When a customer at table 4 complained about a slightly overcooked steak, Paul didn't throw Nora under the bus as usual. He comped the meal and personally apologized. Hector started leaving small plates of perfectly seared scraps on the prep counter specifically for her. It wasn't kindness. It was fear. They all knew the black sedan had waited for her in the alley. In the restaurant industry, gossip moves faster than a grease fire. Thursday afternoon was a slow, dragging rainstorm. The lunch rush had died out, leaving the dining room smelling of wet wool and floor wax. Nora was rolling silverware in the back station, the repetitive motion numbing her exhausted brain. The heavy front doors opened. Nora didn't look up immediately. She heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of wet leather shoes on the hardwood. 3 men. She recognized the gait before she saw the suits. It wasn't Matteo's silent, tailored security. These were the brick walls, Carmelo's men. Paul nearly dropped a stack of menus. He scrambled to the front, smoothing his tie. The lead man ignored Paul entirely. He looked across the empty dining room, his pale, scarred face impassive, and pointed a thick finger at Nora. "Grab your coat," the man said. His voice sounded like a shovel scraping concrete. Nora froze, a napkin half rolled in her hands. "I'm on shift." "Don Carmelo requires lunch," the man replied. "He requires you to serve it. The car is outside." Paul didn't object. He practically shoved Nora toward the coat closet. She stripped off her apron, her hands numb, and grabbed her cheap winter coat. She didn't bother arguing. You don't argue with men whose jackets bulge at the ribs. She slid her hand into her jeans pocket, feeling the outline of the burner phone. Matteo had said to call if someone followed her. He hadn't said what to do if his own father abducted her for lunch service. The ride was short, ending at a boutique hotel downtown that Nora knew charged $3,000 a night. They didn't take the main elevator. They took a freight lift through the loading dock, bypassing the lobby entirely. The penthouse suite smelled aggressively of unfiltered cigarettes, garlic, and old-world decay. The space was massive, decorated in sterile modern greys and whites, but it had been entirely overtaken by Carmelo's presence. Heavy curtains were drawn against the afternoon rain. A half-dozen men sat around a glass dining table, playing cards and drinking small cups of pitch-black espresso. Don Carmelo sat in a wingback chair by the window. He was peeling an orange with a small, vicious-looking pearl-handled knife. He didn't look up when Nora was escorted into the room. He finished peeling the fruit in one long, unbroken spiral, set the knife down, and popped a segment into his mouth. "They tell me you are a quiet girl," Carmelo said in English, the accent thick and heavy. "They say you come to work, you keep your head down, you take the train home. A good, boring girl." Nora stood perfectly still. "I try to be, sir. My son is not boring." Carmelo wiped his fingers on a linen napkin. "My son is a machine. He builds, he acquires, he negotiates. But he has a weakness. He thinks this country has made him civilized. He thinks he can wear a suit and play by the rules of the boardrooms, and the blood on his hands will just wash off." Carmelo leaned forward, bracing his weight on his silver-tipped cane, the watery pale eyes fixed on her. "He brought you to his table, a civilian, a waitress with holes in her shoes." The Don's lip curled. "That makes you a target, little bird. It makes you a liability to my family." "I didn't ask to sit at his table," Nora kept her voice flat. Showing fear to a man like this was bleeding in shark water. "I don't want his money. I don't want his protection. I just want to be left alone." Carmelo chuckled. It was a dry, rattling sound. "Sina spira." "You have grit." He gestured toward a rolling cart near the kitchen area. It was loaded with covered silver trays. "Serve the food, Nora. Show me this steady hand of yours again. Let us see if you drop the plates when the men in the room have killed more people than you have met in your life." She didn't hesitate. She walked to the cart. Her heart was beating so hard it hurt her ribs, but her hands were entirely steady. She lifted the first silver dome, baked ziti, swimming in a rich, dark ragu. She picked up a heavy serving spoon and a warm porcelain plate. She moved around the table, serving the card players. They ignored her, speaking in rapid, low Italian, slamming cards onto the glass. She was invisible again. It was a familiar, comforting armor. She approached Carmelo last. She set the plate down carefully, placing a clean fork and knife precisely parallel to the rim. "Your grandfather," Carmelo murmured, looking at the food. "The baker. Did he die in a bed, or did he die on his feet?" "He died in a hospital bed, choking on fluid," Nora answered bluntly. "A bad death, a weak death." "It was a human death," Nora countered softly. Carmelo looked up, his eyes narrowing. Before he could respond, the heavy double doors of the penthouse didn't just open, they cracked inward with the force of a battering ram. Matteo walked into the room. The air in the penthouse instantly crystallized. The card players froze, their hands hovering over the table. The massive bodyguards guarding the doors stepped back, actively lowering their eyes. Matteo wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His tie was ripped loose, his white shirt rolled up at the forearms. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like the violent son of a ruthless warlord. His dark eyes swept the room, entirely skipping the armed men, and locked instantly onto Nora. He saw the serving spoon in her hand. He saw the apron they had forced her to wear. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Get your coat," Matteo said to her. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a terrifying, hollow quiet. "Matteo," Carmelo said from his chair, his voice dripping with condescension. "The girl was just serving lunch. She is very good at it. You should have left her at the restaurant where she belongs." Matteo ignored his father. He walked straight toward Nora, closing the distance in long, predatory strides. He grabbed the heavy serving spoon from her fingers and tossed it onto the silver tray. The clatter rang out like a gunshot in the silent room. "I said, get your coat." "I'm fine, Matteo," Nora whispered, acutely aware of the 6 armed men watching them. Matteo finally turned to look at his father. The physical resemblance between the two men was suddenly jarring. They shared the same cold, architectural bone structure, but where Carmelo's cruelty was loud and boastful, Matteo's was a deep, pressurized trench. "You do not touch what is mine," Matteo told his father. The dialect rolled off his tongue, thick and lethal. "Si tu la tocci, io ti taglio I manu." Carmelo's pale eyes widened slightly. A tense, terrible silence stretched between them. Then the old man leaned back in his chair and smiled. It was a chilling expression. "So," Carmelo rasped in English, "it is like that. You claim a stray dog, and you bare your teeth at your own blood. You are a fool, Matteo. You just showed everyone in this room exactly where your throat is." Matteo didn't reply. He placed a hand on the small of Nora's back, a firm, undeniable pressure, and steered her toward the door. Nobody stopped them. They walked out of the penthouse, down the long corridor, and into the waiting elevator. The doors slid shut, cutting off the heavy scent of smoke and garlic. The descent was completely silent for 15 floors. Nora stared at the brushed steel doors. Her legs were beginning to shake, the adrenaline crashing hard. She crossed her arms, digging her fingers into her own biceps to stop the trembling. Matteo stood beside her, radiating a suppressed, violent heat. "I didn't call you," Nora said finally, staring at the floor numbers ticking down. "I had the phone. I didn't use it. You didn't need to come." "My men at the restaurant called me," Matteo said harshly. "They watched his thugs put you in a car. Do you have any idea what went through my head for the last 20 minutes? "I was just serving baked ziti," Nora snapped, her own exhaustion boiling over into anger. "He just wanted to prove a point. He wanted to show me that you don't control him, and he wanted to show you that I'm completely defenseless. Message received. We both get it." Matteo hit the emergency stop button on the elevator panel. The car jolted to a halt between the 14th and 13th floors. The sudden silence was absolute. Matteo turned to her. He crowded her against the handrail, his hands slamming flat against the steel wall on either side of her shoulders. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling inches from hers. "You don't get it," Matteo said, his voice a raw scrape. "You think this is a game of leverage. You think my father is just a bully. He kills people for spilling his coffee, Nora. He kills people because he is bored. He brought you here to see if I would panic, and I did." Nora stared up at him. She saw the dark, frantic energy in his eyes, the absolute loss of the composed, untouchable boss. "I told you," Nora whispered, her voice cracking. "I told you I just wanted to be invisible. You made me a target." "I know." Matteo closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, his forehead dropping until it almost touched hers. "I know I did, and I can't undo it. The second I sat at your table, the second I let them see I cared whether you breathed or not, I put a mark on your back." He opened his eyes. They were obsidian, hard and desperate. "You don't belong in my world," Matteo said softly. "You are too honest, you are too clean, but you are in it now, and I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone touch you. Do you understand me?" Nora swallowed hard. The cynical, exhausted part of her wanted to push him away, to demand he fix the mess he made. But the human part of her, the part that had spent years alone, carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, felt a terrifying spark of warmth in the dark. "Take me home, Matteo," she said quietly. He held her gaze for a long moment, then pushed away from the wall. He reached out, pulled the emergency switch back out, and the elevator resumed its descent. The box continued down, carrying them both deeper into the dark. The rain had turned into a freezing, horizontal sheet of glass by the time they reached the street. The black sedan was already idling at the curb. The massive driver stood in the downpour, holding a heavy golf umbrella open, his suit soaked through. He didn't say a word as Matteo ushered Nora into the back seat, shielding her from the worst of the wind. The ride to the Bronx was not silent, but the noise was strictly mechanical. The steady, rhythmic thwack of the windshield wipers, the hum of the tires over flooded asphalt, the heavy, pressurized breathing of two people who had just stepped off the edge of a cliff. Nora stared out the tinted glass. The city blurred into smears of neon and brake lights. She felt entirely hollowed out. Her grandfather used to say that fear burned calories faster than hard labor. He was right. Her muscles ached with a deep, bone-deep fatigue. The car pulled up to her building. The shattered neon sign of the dry cleaner buzzed erratically, casting sickly pink shadows across the wet pavement. Matteo didn't wait for the driver. He opened his own door, stepped into the rain, and walked around to let her out. He followed her through the broken front door, up the 3 flights of stairs that smelled of damp rot, and waited as she slid the heavy steel bar back from her apartment door. She walked inside and reached for the light switch. "Don't turn it on," Matteo said from the doorway. His hand caught her wrist in the dark. Nora froze. "Why?" "Because a silhouette against a lit window is an easy target," he replied softly. "Leave it off. The streetlights are enough." He stepped inside and pushed the green door shut, locking the deadbolt behind him. The dull, amber glow from the street lamp outside filtered through the single window, casting long shadows across the tiny studio. Matteo stood in the center of her life. He looked at the peeling linoleum. He looked at the dented kettle on the rusted stove. He noticed the worn, sagging armchair in the corner where Vincenzo Russo had spent his final years dying of ruined lungs. Matteo's expensive wool overcoat brushed against a stack of unpaid medical bills sitting on the scratched Formica counter. The juxtaposition was sickening. He looked like a panther locked inside a cardboard box. "Pack a bag," Matteo said. It wasn't a suggestion. Nora dropped her keys on the counter. The metal clattered loudly in the dark room. "I have a shift tomorrow at 4. "You don't work at Lombra anymore." "I need that job, Matteo. I have rent to pay. You have a target on your back," Matteo cut in, his voice a low, rough command. "My father didn't bring you to that hotel to test my patience. He brought you there to show his men your face. By tomorrow morning, every low-level enforcer and ambitious hitman looking to gain favor with the old man will know exactly who you are and where you work." He closed the distance between them. In the dim light, his eyes were pitch black. "You can't stay here, Nora. This door wouldn't stop a determined teenager, let alone a professional. If you sleep in this bed tonight, I cannot guarantee you will wake up tomorrow." The fight drained out of her. It didn't leave her slowly. It vanished instantly, like a plug pulled from a sink. She looked at the sagging armchair. She looked at the coffee can under the sink, holding the $500 Carmelo had given her. She was so tired. She had been fighting to survive, fighting to pay the bills, fighting to remain invisible for so long. She walked over to the narrow closet and pulled out a faded canvas duffel bag. She didn't pack much. She didn't own much. A few sweaters, 3 pairs of jeans, the cheap black orthopedics she wore for serving. Matteo watched her. He didn't offer to help. He knew she needed to do this herself, to physically enact the surrender of her old life. But when she walked into the cramped bathroom and began violently sweeping cheap plastic bottles of shampoo and drugstore face wash into her bag, her hands finally betrayed her. A bottle of rubbing alcohol slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the porcelain sink and shattered. The sharp, clinical smell instantly filling the small room. Nora stared at the broken glass. A sob caught in her throat, hard and painful. She clamped a hand over her mouth, refusing to let the sound out, but the tears spilled over, hot and humiliating. Matteo was there instantly. He stepped over the broken glass, gripping her shoulders. He pulled her against his chest, burying her face in the heavy, wet wool of his coat. "I'm sorry," Nora choked out against his collar. "I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm doing anymore." "You are surviving," Matteo murmured, his chin resting against the top of her head. One of his large hands smoothed down her back in a steady, grounding rhythm. "That's all you have to do. Just survive. I will handle the rest." They stood there in the dark bathroom for a long time, the smell of alcohol and expensive cologne masking the rot of the building. When she finally pulled away, she zipped up the canvas bag. Matteo reached down and picked it up. It looked comically small in his grip. They walked to the door. Nora didn't look back. She slid the heavy steel bar open, walked out into the flickering hallway, and locked the deadbolt. She slipped the cheap brass key off her keyring and left it resting on the ledge of the doorframe. She wasn't coming back. She followed Matteo down the stairs and out into the rain, stepping out of the negative space and permanently into the crosshairs. The tension has officially reached its boiling point. Nora has left her old life behind, but surviving in Matteo's ruthless world is going to require more than just a heavy locked door. What do you think will happen when Don Carmelo realizes his son has fully taken her under his protection? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you felt the heartbreak and suspense in this chapter, please hit that like button, share this video with a friend who loves mafia romance, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next part.